Yo, this is a book review video. Shout out to my pressure cooker, seen in the background there, my brand new pressure cooker. This school normally does not allow students to cook or prepare food in their rooms, but I talked to the boss here, I talked to the managing director. She's also vegan, and she made an exception in my case. I think, I've talked about this on Patreon. I haven't talked about it on YouTube, but I really have been struggling with my diet here in many ways. And now that I have the pressure cooker, in theory I can cook beans. Lately I've been cooking a type of grain. It's called Job's Tears. It's a high protein grain, about 4 grams of protein to 1 gram of fat. Hopefully that's going to make my life here a little bit easier to endure. The book I'm going to review was very kindly sent to me by one of my viewers. First book review I've done in a long time. First time I've read a book in English in a long time. One of the things that's depressing about studying so many foreign languages is that you really do not spend that much time doing quality reading in your own language. So this is Half-Earth, a book by a famous and award-winning scientist named Edward O. Wilson. And this handsome hard copy version of the book, you guys may or may not have seen this on YouTube. I asked one of my viewers to send me a copy, someone who already had it, who already read it, send me a secondhand copy, because the costs of shipping and so on here in China, this is only printed in America or in the Western world somewhere, New York and London, it just was impossible to justify the cost. It would have cost me like 40 plus US dollars, and as I could tell just by looking on the internet, it's not that much of a book. I realize it doesn't look too skinny, but in terms of the amount of words per page, this is a very slim 200 and some page volume, which does not have a lot to say. Right off the bat, that is one of the weaknesses of this book. It is light. Now, I have worked as a professional editor of nonfiction, most of it being academic nonfiction, so nonfiction written by professors and what have you, and I can imagine the struggles that the editors have with this book. It is very poorly written. I should say off the bat, for me it's regrettable. I asked for a copy of this book. I didn't buy it. I asked my viewers to send me a copy of this book. Oh, and by the way, the guy who gave the gift, thank you very much, but he chooses to remain anonymous. He said just let people know it was sent in by an American viewer. So thanks to you. Thanks to the USA. The title of the book is really the best part of the book. It's called Half-Earth, and that's almost all you need to know about it. The guy's thesis is that 50% of the Earth should be transformed into nature conservation areas, protected areas, biodiversity conservation areas, whatever you want to say, for the future of the ecological services of the planet. That's all you need to know. That's the best part of the book. That's the concept. That's it. There is absolutely nothing else about this book that's worth reading or worth knowing. And on the contrary, if you force yourself to read any significant percentage of this book, you run into many of the problems I had myself with career academics. To give an example, so Edward O. Wilson, he is a distinguished scientist. He knows nothing about writing. He's a very, very poor creative writer, but he also knows nothing about economics. Now, the most obvious flaw in this plan or question, most crushing obstacle to someone who actually wanted to make 50% of the planet into biodiversity conservation areas, into national parks or something of that kind, is economic. With a country like Canada, it's easy to visualize because we have so much seemingly empty land. In reality, when you look into it, that land is exploited economically in various ways, whether it's for timber or for mining, or whether it's disused, abandoned land that's already been destroyed by activities such as timber and mining industries, pulp and paper industry, resource extraction. But still, you look at the map of Canada and think, could 50% of Canada be national parks? Seems viable. Okay, let's look at a country like Tonga. Tonga is poverty-stricken, both in terms, it's not even so much the poverty of the people, the poverty of the government, the impossibility of the government ever digging itself out of debt, the impossibility of the government ever meeting the costs of things like healthcare and infrastructure and education. And yes, the poverty of the people, the citizens of Tonga, is also considerable, but it's not the kind of acute and extreme poverty you might visualize from, newspaper headlines. Tonga isn't that badly off, but there are very, very real problems short term and long term. Do you want to take Tonga, the tiny, struggling island nation of Tonga, and make it into 50% of it into national parks? How is that going to work economically? An example you guys will be shocked to hear me mention. This scarf is made in Cambodia, by the way. How about Cambodia? How about Laos? How about any of those countries I'm familiar with? When I was in Laos, again, I did work inside the government, and that's really not saying anything. Laos is a communist country. A huge percentage of the population are employed by the government. But I did spend a lot of time talking to government officials and so on. And I mean, what Laos was doing at that time was declaring special protected areas. They were called biodiversity conservation areas, but the reality was economic exploitation within those areas was intensive. So trees were being cut down, industries of various kinds were being pursued, economic development was being pursued, and those areas included, villages and towns. They weren't depopulated, empty areas such as we in Canada can boast of. They were areas that had indigenous people, tribal people still living in tribes, but also settled populations of farmers, whole industries and what have you. And, they say they're going to declare a biodiversity conservation area, but then what does that really mean in practice? Among the peculiar Achilles heels of this book, and it has many, is the fact that it mentions the current statistic maintained by the United Nations is that already 15% of the world consists of protected areas. But when you look into that, I think there are 7 different categories of protected areas, and in some cases, protected does not mean much. You're talking about a protected area, but it's actually being operated as a ski lodge, as a tourist-oriented, theme park that has some trees in it or something. I remember last time the U.S. had the Winter Olympics. I don't care much about the Olympics, distant memory, but I remember seeing a documentary looking at the national parks in that part of the United States and how intensely they were being exploited for the Olympics and for tourism, and just how weak their claim was to being a national park or to being a conservation area and these types of problems. But I mean, when you read the few pages this has about economics, it's laughable. A child could refute it. When I was 11 years old, I could have refuted this. I might have been a very strange 11-year-old. But I mean, I really wasn't a boy genius. When I was 11, I think I was still playing Sega Master System and was still playing video games. I was a normal kid. But I mean, the economic argument is absolutely laughable. It's complete garbage. And it reminded me of, especially in anthropology, I would meet these people who had achieved some level of success and distinction in anthropology. They had PhDs, they'd done research. But then as soon as the question turned to politics, they would try to show how sophisticated they were by making, very edgy and extreme statements about economics and economic theory. But all it showed was that, they were just pitiably ignorant. They did not have a 101 level education in economics. They did not understand the basics. And they were just accustomed to going to cocktail parties with other people in their discipline and making these statements about economics and having other people who probably have glasses of wine in their hands, probably just enjoying themselves, who are not in a position to really scrutinize them. Even if they know better, they're not going to say it, nodding their heads or acting amused or approving of them. I mean, really, my feeling about Edward O. Wilson, I believe in the footnotes, he says he first put forward this idea in print, the Half-Earth thesis, in the year 2002. I'm guessing that between 2002 and 2016, he's been to a lot of cocktail parties. And he has just become very accustomed to putting this idea forth in the company of people who are not really going to criticize him, not really going to scrutinize his claims. And, and let me tell you what I have to say about economics and what the impacts will be in the world economy. He is just not used to presenting this to any kind of crowd who would actually scrutinize it or even think through practically the steps for implementation. Now, of course, the irony is, do I sympathize with the hypothesis? Yes. The only reason why I have this book is that the basic concept appeals to me. It appeals to me that scientists would sit down, crunch the numbers, and say, look, let's come up with a target where we have to draw a line on the map and really say this is the minimum requirement for different types of forests. This is how much rainforest we need. This is how much old-growth forest in northern Canada we need, that you're going to draw up a series of requirements so that wild species can continue to exist, and so that, this is a United Nations term, so that ecological services are still provided to humanity. Ecological services is a bizarre term. It is heavily used by the United Nations. But the point is that if we don't have enough forest, existing, then in a sense we don't have enough drinking water, or we don't have the rain cycle. We don't even have enough. Some of the things that happen with soil, forests can be tremendously important for. So actually, again, this is a very United Nations way of thinking about the world, but especially in third world countries that they're trying to assist. Very often, UN programs will try to make up a list of what are the crucial ecological services provided by a certain type of forest, and that may be everything from maintaining the stability of a river system, where you want to prevent soil erosion. You need the forest to hold the land together, down to, for example, forest products, non-timber forest products that indigenous people collect. There may be tribal people who really earn their living from gathering things in the forest. So where I was, rattan, something that resembles wicker rattan was gathered by the forest. All kinds of things are gathered from the forest. Obviously, very unvegan example, fur. If you have fur trappers who rely on wild animals in the forest, if you have people gathering mushrooms that rely on the forest, where you can actually itemize the ecological services. So these are things provided to humanity, such as having drinking water or air to breathe. And then you can try to come up with estimates for how much forest you need to conserve for those reasons. And this, of course, the emphasis is also on how much wilderness and habitat you need to preserve so that the species themselves will remain intact, will continue to exist on planet Earth. There's no point. I mean, Edward O. Wilson is a terrible author. The quality of writing is abysmal. He does not think about what his audience needs to hear and what they don't need to hear. There are many parts of this book where it's just like he's getting into the definition of a term, the meaning of a word, where it's like anyone advanced enough to want to read this book couldn't possibly benefit from this discussion. Not just many of the discussion, many pages are taken up with stuff where nobody who is at the level of interest to read this book could possibly benefit from. He didn't think about his audience or who they are, what questions they're going to ask. And then on the other hand, the really deep problems that are raised by this hypothesis are not dealt with at all, or kind of laughed at and run roughshod over. Economically, I mean, he relies on an incredibly weak comparison to the current and ongoing history of digital technology. So many of you know about this. There are these kind of fashionable statistics of pointing out, on the software side or on the hardware side, how computers are being more and more productive with less and less material. Now, whether that's the computer performing more computational tasks on a smaller and smaller scale, or you actually want to talk about the amount of material, the amount of metal being used, or if you want to calculate it in a more abstract sense in terms of the amount of data being processed in relation to the amount of electricity being used, or what have you. Yes, computer technology is an example of a sector of the economy where you look at just the final product, you can have these seemingly very impressive examples of how the intensivity, the productivity, the amount of output given the same amount of input seems to, with time, double or quadruple or grow exponentially in a very short amount of time. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for pointing out the complete obvious, Edward O. Wilson. But we were talking about resource use and habitat conservation, etc. So now let's talk about meat. Do you think that cows are going to become exponentially more productive in this same way? Do you think cows are going to produce more and more milk or more and more beef in the same way that the progress of science has allowed the same amount of metal and silicone and plastic to produce more and more data? It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, there are other critiques of that technology model. I can remember the bad old days of computers. The first portable computer I ever lifted was an Olivetti portable, a solid steel monstrosity, and the exterior was steel that, an elderly person could not lift. It would take, some people use 2 hands to lift this portable computer. And of course it had an old-fashioned monitor, it had 2 disk drives, the true floppy disks, back when floppy disks were actually floppy. It was this horrible monstrosity, incredibly inefficient compared to today's computers in terms of its weight, the amount of materials used, the amount of electricity used, etc. But guess what? The actual productivity of a human being using that computer is remarkably similar to the computers we have today. The computer I have today is much more powerful than the computer that was used to put a man on the moon decades and decades ago. It's so much more powerful. And yet when I sit down and do word processing, when I sit down and write an essay, it's not actually any more productive. The amount of time it takes my computer to start up may be a little bit quicker, but that's about it. So again, even in a business context, if you say, how much time does it take Edward O. Wilson to write this book? to sit down and type it at a computer with a computer manufactured in 2016 as opposed to a computer manufactured in 1996. The computer itself is more powerful, but that does not really equate to more economic productivity. This is one of many, many aspects. But obviously, if we're looking on a social scale, computers are not a representative part of the world economy. They're a completely unique holotype within the world economy. And the concerns this guy has should be about wood, should be about, if you want to make a table out of wood in the year 2016, and you think about the forest production, the timber production behind that, do you think that has changed dramatically between 1996 and 2016? The productivity involved? In some ways, making furniture out of wood hasn't changed that much in 200 years. In terms of what we rely on, the ecological services, the ecological footprint, the exploitation, etc. Yes, for one thing, you can just make a table out of plastic. You could in 1996 also. But the economic reasoning here, where he simply says, oh, well, this is how the computer industry is transformed, therefore this is how the whole economy is going to transform, and in the future we don't need to worry about giving up 50% of our land for conservation of habitat. It's totally surreal and totally laughable. Even computers do not really work that way, but the manufacture of furniture out of wood doesn't work that way. And for vegans, the most painful part is ignoring food. Food, clothing, furniture. In terms of ecological impact and the existence of human civilization on the scale of billions of people, these are really the big questions. Computers are simply not the big question for the future of our civilization. And yes, the fact that you have billions of people eating cows and chickens is of such outstanding importance that even if you're not vegan, if you're just someone with a sincere interest in, the future of planet Earth, you have to pay attention to this. So again, this technological, dead end of reasoning that he leads us into. What do you think? Do you think that the technological improvements to cattle ranching and chicken farming, do you think those will result in the future, do you think that's going to result in exponentially more and more productivity for meat and less use of resources, such as water? We don't even have to talk about land and food. The food that's fed to cattle and pigs, things are all ridiculous. Obviously, they can't get more efficient. Well, they can get slightly more efficient because factory farming can become even more immoral, cruel, and inhumane to these animals. Yes, you can refine the factory farming process to be even more efficient, to feed these animals less, to slaughter them more rapidly, to make them grow more quickly, etc. But when you add it up on a global scale, there's just no sense in which you can look to the future and think that the production of chicken meat, cow milk, beef, pork is going to, for example, use exponentially less water, exponentially less land, and the use of land includes the land that's currently producing feed for those animals. So this is really offering a kind of dangerous series of technophilic delusions, along with a thesis that, although I sympathize with it, is neither proven nor even discussed in an interesting manner in this book. So for me, even though I'm very strongly biased in favor of this author, I have to regard this as a complete failure. Now, how does this fit into the history of ecology in our times? To me, this is really like a kind of sad appendix to the games that have gone on at the United Nations. If you look at the discourse on ecological sustainability at the UN, the crucial issue has been actually the delusion that technology can solve our problems. The United Nations guidelines basically draw up that the world's population can continue to expand, that the amount of land we're exploiting can continue to expand, etc., etc. And indeed, as you guys know from this channel, from everyone else, that the amount of meat we're producing can continue to expand, on the assumption that technology is going to increasingly render ecological services obsolete and irreparable. That somehow the progress of technology is going to mean that a city like Kunming or a city like Toronto that's sitting on a lake will be less and less reliant on the water that is in that lake. That ecological services are going to be replaced with time by technological services. Back when I was in university, I read the actual United Nations documents that define sustainability, and basically the minutes of the meetings where they came up with this, how sustainability was going to be defined and measured, and what the United Nations protocol for this was going to be. This is known as, within political science, the substitutability hypothesis. So it's the idea that technology and human innovation can provide substitutes for ecological services. Now, I probably do not need to spell it out for you guys. Anyone who has done 5 minutes of research, this also falls into the class of ideas that a child could refute. The extent to which technology can provide substitutes for ecological services is incredibly limited. Is it possible for human beings to collect their own urine and have a machine that processes the urine so that it becomes drinking water, so that those human beings do not rely on rainfall or lakes or rivers, being fresh, so that Mexico City doesn't have to worry about pumping up water from deep well reserves? Yes, that is true to a tiny extent. But if you think that Mexico City could actually provide 100% of its drinking water from processed urine, you're insane. I mean, if you just look into it, if you do 5 minutes of research on it, you realize that this is not even 1% of the problem can be defrayed this way. That no, actually, for Mexico City and all of these, for the future of Las Vegas, Nevada, the question of the finite nature of ecological services, whether we're talking about rivers or the forests that ultimately create the rain cycle for those rivers, et cetera, that no, actually, all of our civilization sits in a tremendously delicate balance. And it's just not the case that now or in future we're going to be able to flip a switch and provide fundamental things like water. We're going to provide water out of thin air. To replace ecological services once they're damaged, destroyed, what have you. I mean, one of the ultimate examples of that is the reliance on desalination plants. Can technology convert seawater into fresh drinking water? It can, but the cost is unbelievably high, the cost in energy, etc. So then what? You're burning coal in order to convert salt water into fresh drinking water. That does happen all over the world. It happens in oil-rich nations. It happens, to my knowledge, during the drought. It has been happening again in California. But the extent to which technology can actually supply these services once the actual service is destroyed is incredibly limited. So what can I say? Half-Earth. The only thing you need to know about this book basically is the title. Some scientist came up with this idea that we should aim for the target of having 50% of the world be protected areas. By United Nations definition, we're already at 15%. And it's not solving any of our problems, sadly. To me, this book raises many interesting questions, but none of those questions are discussed in the book. There's absolutely nothing interesting within the book, so the book is a total disappointment to me. This book primarily reminds me of, one, the dangerous delusion that people who know nothing about economics believe they have a powerful insight into economics because they've never been challenged, they've never even engaged in casual conversations about the topic. They've just been going to cocktail parties with other people with PhDs in their own field. And it also reminds me of the dangerous delusions about the progress of science and technology itself, delusions that are so influential, partly because of the United Nations guidelines on sustainability and the so-called substitutability hypothesis. That's it, folks. Thanks for hanging in with me.